Hi, my name is Alex, and today I would like to present my paper to you, which the title is Analyzing Fisher's Narrative Paradigm, An Analysis of Storytelling in the Rhetorical Tradition. So just to give you a quick preview of what I'm going to go over today, I'm going to talk about my introduction. I'm going to introduce my paper to you. I'm going to discuss and explain Fisher's narrative paradigm and what it involves, its main concepts. I'm going to go over a couple of key studies that I presented in my literature review of my paper that I felt were important. I'm going to give you some of what I feel about the narrative paradigm and some of what I agree with and what I disagree with, and then I will conclude. So to start, the purpose of my paper was to mainly analyze Fisher's narrative paradigm and present the main concepts that it involves. And I also would like to provide for you some of the ways that scholars have utilized the narrative paradigm to study public speech and political discourse and advertising. So to begin, in his very early literature, Walter Fisher defined narrative and paradigm separately. He defined narrative as stories of symbolic actions that rely on the interpretation of the audience, and he defined paradigm as the structure that is used to form that narrative in understanding and experiencing human communication. So the five major components of Fisher's narrative paradigm, the first one is that humans are storytellers and that all language is encompassed in narrative, that we're always speaking in narrative form when interacting with one another. The second component involves the reasons behind why we tell these stories and whether or not what Fisher calls good reasons. These good reasons are based off of history, culture, or character of the person telling the story. He then discussed narrative probability and fidelity, which involves understanding and truth behind each story, and I'll get into that a little further in the next slide. And lastly, the narrative paradigm says that world is based on a set of stories that we must choose from in order to live a good life. So, for narrative probability, this encompasses the idea of coherence, whether or not a story is understandable to the person listening to it, and does the story hold a complete sequence of thought without any contradiction. Narrative fidelity is the truth behind the story, and whether this truth rings true with someone that believes what they believe is true in their own lives. And Fisher stated that in order for a narrative to be understandable and to persuade someone, the narrative must encompass probability and fidelity. The narrative paradigm also allows for a constructive argument, and this is what makes it fall under the rhetorical tradition. Fisher stated that narrative is able to capture the experiences of the world. So when you're telling a story, people can relate to it. Second, it can assess a story's coherence and truth based on culture and universal experience. And lastly, it identifies with the audience because, like I said, people relate to stories. So a good way to present a persuadable argument is to tell a story, is to tell a narrative. So moving on, now that I've provided you with an explanation of what Fisher's narrative paradigm is, I'll just present to you a couple studies that I found important in my literature review. The first study concentrated on political discourse and really assessed how Reagan used the narrative paradigm in his political speech. And so Reagan doesn't just use stories to persuade the public, but his entire speech is a story. His entire message is a story. Whenever he's talking to his audience, he's telling a narrative. Secondly, he uses anecdotes, which are clear-cut arguments in telling stories. One of the biggest examples that was given in this article was prayer in public schools. And lastly, he also used myths, which encompass origins and destiny. And the biggest thing that he used in this kind of speech was America's destiny, and telling his audience that they could be a part of America's great destiny if they voted for him and agreed with his political agenda. And the second study I would like to present to you involves advertising. And Bush and Bush analyzed a Reebok ad using the narrative paradigm, and they analyzed the ethicality using narrative probability and narrative fidelity of this advertisement. So a quick explanation of this advertisement. Two people in the Reebok ad were about to go bungee jumping, and one of the people going bungee jumping is wearing Reebok sneakers and the other one is wearing Nike sneakers. In the advertisement, the person with the Nike sneakers is presumed to die from the bungee jumping just because they weren't wearing Reebok tennis shoes. So in analyzing the ethicality of this advertisement, they found that narrative probability was prevalent because the audience identifies with the concept of competition. But they did not find narrative fidelity because the audience is not expecting this conclusion in the advertisement. They're not expecting someone to die. And they also felt that narrative fidelity was not prevalent because having a death of a person when you're simply trying to advertise a shoe commercial is not very moral in the author's opinion. Not everyone agrees with narrative paradigm, Fisher's narrative paradigm, and one prominent scholar, Roland, had a few limitations when looking at his theory. First, he felt that the narrative paradigm was too broad and it encompasses too many avenues of discourse. Secondly, he rejects the idea that narrative rationality is independent from the rational world paradigm, and narrative rationality is what we discussed as narrative probability and narrative fidelity. And lastly, he rejects the notion that the role of the expert is the storyteller. So I would like to focus on, under my perspective, Roland's first limitation with the narrative paradigm, which I happen to agree with. I feel that the narrative paradigm is a little too broad. I feel that not every time we're speaking to someone, we're intending to tell a story. I mean, I understand that we do utilize narratives in our speeches, in our conversation, but I don't feel we are always trying to tell a story. So in essence, we use narrative in our language, but narrative is not our language as a whole. And a couple future recommendations for research. Studies that I found for this paper really focused on public speech to an audience, whether it be in advertising or political speech. I feel like more studies should be done on an interpersonal level. How do people communicating in relationships, whether it be friendships, romantic relationships, familial relationships, how do they talk to each other utilizing the narrative paradigm? And secondly, if we are going to concentrate on political discourse, I would like to see some more studies involving the current political environment. How does Barack Obama utilize the narrative paradigm when he's talking to an audience? Or Mitt Romney? Someone who's a little more current would be very interesting to see how these people use storytelling in their political discourse. So to give a quick review, I introduced my paper and its purposes. I explained the narrative paradigm. I presented to you a couple of key studies from my literature review. I then focused on my perspective of the narrative paradigm, and then I concluded. Thank you very much.